So, Peter Brukner, welcome.
Thank you.
Just so, for those of you that don't know, if you notice the accent, Peter's actually Australian.
Don't hold that against me. Okay.
And up until today, I only thought that he had been the team doctor for the Australian cricket team. But I've since found out that he has a sports medicine practice and has actually been involved with sporting teams at the Olympics, World Championships, all sorts of things, and over the years has become involved in the low carb community. So I think let's maybe just talk about a little bit where you came from and how you ended up deciding that this was a better way to be.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it really sort of started 6 years ago now. I was living in England, in Liverpool, England. I was working for the Liverpool Soccer Club as the head of their sports medicine department, and I just turned 60 years of age, and which was the age my father had developed type 2 diabetes. So I was pretty keen not to go down that track.
Right.
I sort of thought I was pretty healthy, really, but in retrospect, I clearly wasn't. I was overweight. I was probably 15 kilograms overweight. What's that in? That's
about 33
pounds. Yeah. And I'd probably put on a pound a year for 30 years. Just gradually sort of put it on, mainly around my belly, and my kids are sort of starting to poke me in the stomach and say, "Come on, Dad," and I'd shrug my shoulders and say, "Well, I'm doing all the right things. I'm eating low fat this, low fat that. I'm exercising," and yet I was still putting on weight. And I had my triglycerides were high. I had a condition called fatty liver, which is you can tell from a blood test that you get fatty infiltrates in your liver. And a typical doctor, I totally ignored that, as we do. Yeah. I didn't really understand what a fatty liver was, and I figured I was on a low-fat diet, so yeah, I was fine. And we're very good at denial, us doctors. So that was my situation, and then I heard that Tim Noakes, your fellow South African from Cape Town, who's an old friend of mine. Tim and I have known each other for probably 30 years. We've been speaking at conferences together, and we're both in the sort of sports medicine world. And I sort of read that he'd said he'd changed his mind about carbs. He'd always been a big proponent of carbs. He wrote the book Law of Running, which is sort of the Bible of distance running, and it was pages and pages on how important carbs were.
Right. And
all of a sudden he said, no, I was wrong. That carbs are not good for you, and that he'd changed from. So his own personal experience, where he developed type 2 diabetes, he was overweight, he was feeling terrible, and he tried, really just on a whim, tried a low carb diet, and he said after a week he was a new person. And so Tim, as I said, I'd known for a long time, and I'd always admired, and he, in the past, he'd challenged a number of orthodoxies in sports science, and he'd always been proven right. But I must admit, I thought this time he'd really lost it. He'd lost the plot completely. And I thought, no, Tim's finally, he's been on the edge for a while, but he's finally gone over the edge now. And but I did remember that he'd been proven right previously. So I thought, no, I need to look into this. So I read a book, bought a book and read a book by Gary Taubes, who's a New York journalist, called Good Calories, Bad Calories, or The Diet Delusion, I think it was called in the UK. But it was a very disturbing experience reading that book, because that book talked about sort of the different merits of the low carb and the low fat sort of diets, but most interestingly it talked about the sort of the history and the politics of how the low fat movement had won out over the low carb movement, which turned out to be for not at all for reasons of science, but purely reasons of money and politics and US agriculture and so on. And as I said, I found it a very disturbing book. I remember I'd put it down at night, and I'd sort of say to myself, no, this couldn't be right. We couldn't have got something as fundamental as this wrong for the last 30 years.
So badly wrong.
It's badly wrong. And the more you read, I found it very disturbing. But it certainly, got my interest up. And then I started to read a whole bunch of books and scientific articles. I really just threw myself into it, and the more I read, the more I more I realised that that Tim Noakes was right, and that Gary Charles was right, and that we really had got this wrong. And then I thought, well, I'm a scientist, so it's time to do some science.
Right.
And but as everyone knows, a scientific experiment with an n=1 is meaningless, except when the one is you. Exactly. In which case, it becomes very meaningful. So I decided it was time for an n=1 experiment. So I got all my bloods done on day one, and then I went pretty hardcore low carb. So stopped eating all the things that I'd been eating a lot of, pasta and rice and cereals and so on. And stopped eating all sugar. Stopped drinking fruit juice. Largely cut back on my fruit intake. And went back to eating the sort of the way that my my grandparents had eaten. Eggs and bacon and full fat cream and cheese and milk and so on. And it was dramatic. I mean, within a few days, the first thing I noticed was I wasn't nearly as hungry. Instead of normally in the morning I'd have my cereal and 8 o'clock or whatever, and then by 10:30 I'll be looking at my watch saying, God, it must be time for lunch soon. And be starving the whole time. I was constantly hungry. Whereas with a higher fat, lower carb breakfast, I wasn't hungry at all. In fact, I cut back to 2 meals a day. I'd have maybe a snack of some nuts or cheese through the day, but most days I just have nothing between, which was dramatic. And so I went from 3 meals and 3 snacks probably to 2 meals. Right. It's just dramatic. And then I started weighing myself every week, and every week I just lost 1 kilogram every week. It was just incredible. I mean, they say, oh, the first week you just lose fluid or something. I said, oh, okay, I lost that, and then the second week, third, and I lost 13 kilograms, so that's 30 odd pounds in 13 weeks.
And you actually consistently lost
pretty much, yeah, but varied a little bit, but between a pound, between 1 and 2 pounds a week for every week for 13 weeks, and I lost the 30 pounds, and I would, family said, then started telling me, oh, you're looking a bit thin there, you sure you haven't gone too far? Then at the end of that 13 weeks, I did my bloods again, and my triglycerides had come down to normal. My fatty liver that I'd had for 10 years completely disappeared. Went back to normal, absolutely back to normal. Unbelievable. I just couldn't believe it, just blew me away. And I felt so much better. My exercise tolerance got better. There was one serious problem though. I had to get a new wardrobe. Oh. None of my clothes fit me. So I went from went down 2 sizes in trousers and so on.
Chuck everything
so
out.
It's very expensive, but I was very happy to pay that price. But no, all jokes aside, I mean, I would never have believed it if I hadn't experienced it myself. And then I just backed off a little bit, and I just maintained that weight pretty much for the last 6 years. So then I've continued to read a lot ever since. I started getting involved in some of the low carb groups. We have a group in Australia called Low Carb Down Under that Rod Taylor has started up, and they run seminars and so on. So I started speaking at those, and I've just been very involved in the whole low carb movement ever since. And
what about introducing this to some of the sportsmen that you were seeing in your practice?
Yeah, well, it was interesting at that time. Soon after I started, actually, I started working with the Australian cricket team, which is a big deal in Australia. It's our national sporting team.
Yeah,
so I started. They spent a lot of time on the road. We spent about 10 months of the year on the road, so it's pretty much a full-time job. Mm-hmm. And I actually lost my weight, lost that 13 kilograms between my first and my second tour with them. So I've rocked up to the second tour, and they've all gone, "Oh, Jesus, Doc, you're a shadow of your former self." Right. And that created quite a bit of interest. And so, look, it wasn't really my role to sort of push the nutrition. They had a dietitian, and so I was reluctant to sort of get too involved. But the guys would sort of come up to me and say, "Well, tell me, what have you done? Yeah, tell me how you did this." And I had one dramatic episode. I had one of the cricketers, very very good cricketer, who'd had a lot of trouble with his knee, and he'd been around everywhere, and no one could work out what was wrong with him. And eventually, they saw a rheumatologist who made a diagnosis of seronegative arthritis, which is similar to rheumatoid arthritis, but quite a serious condition. And and they put him on some very powerful, very expensive drugs. And so when I met him, he was having to inject himself with this very powerful, expensive drug. It was about $15,000 a year at the drug. It was an autoimmune drug. And he was injecting that once a fortnight. And he said to me, you know, about day 10 of the fortnight, he'd start to get an ache in his knee, and he'd know it was time to inject his. But he couldn't train fully, and he was struggling with his fitness, and he was a little bit overweight. So he came up and said, "Look, you know, I'd like to try your diet, as they called it, Doc's diet, and to lose some weight."
Right.
And I remember saying to him thinking at the time, "Well, it'd be interesting to see what happens with his knee as well." But anyway, he went on the low carb diet. We were in India at the time, so it's not the easiest place to go low carb when every meal seems to have rice with it. But no, he was very good. He was very strict, and got into it really conscientiously. 3 weeks later, he came up to me and said, "Doc, I forgot to take my injection last week." And I said, "Well, how come?" And he said, "Well, I haven't had any pain." And normally that's the thing that reminds
triggers
me.
it, right? Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, what should I do? You know, should I take my injection?" I said, "Well, no, just back off." Anyway, no more injections, no more pain.
Wow.
Was able to increase his training to
So
the
that
full amount.
anti-inflammatory benefit of that diet is just
Unbelievable. And no, you know,
And that's to be-
amazed
that's-
me, and it certainly amazed him. I mean, he, to this day, we still look at each other in amazement and say, that's crazy. But you know, since then, I've put a lot of people on this diet for its anti-inflammatory effect, and invariably they reduce their inflammation, whether that's their arthritis or whatever. I mean, myself, I'd always had an Achilles tendon issue, and it was funny. I didn't actually realise at the time, but I remember thinking, after a month or two on the diet, I'm thinking, that's funny. I haven't felt my Achilles recently, and so on. So it certainly has an effect on inflammation as well as, and we now know, I think, that chronic inflammation is sort of the underscore of a lot of chronic disease, even atherosclerosis. So much disease is as a result of chronic inflammation, and certainly diet is one of the important factors in inflammation.
in addressing those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we've just come back from Tasmania where we were visiting with the Fakis.
Yes.
And in the chat with Gary, his big thing was he feels like the high carbohydrate diet is a highly inflammatory diet.
Yeah.
And he blames most of the world's problems on inflammation.
Yeah,
and he
I
feels
think,
like if you can get rid of the inflammation, then a lot of these issues go away.
Yeah, I think
Cutting
if
the
you
carbs
take
does that.
atherosclerosis, coronary heart disease as an example, I think the medical profession have swung completely really now from thinking it was all sort of cholesterol and so on to now believing that cholesterol is really the bystander. It's like
Correct.
like
the band-aid or the
it's like the
plaster.
fire truck at the fire.
Right.
They're always there, but they're not the cause.
Exactly.
And so that it's actually this chronic inflammation that sets up an inflammation in the wall of the artery that is the key, the instigating factor. And it seems to be with a lot of disease, and there's a lot of interest now in pursuing that. I mean, things like Alzheimer's disease and even depression and so on have been mooted to be related to inflammation. So I think that's going to be a really exciting area of medicine over the next few years.
Yeah, I
where
think the trials that come out in the next few years are going to be
very exciting.
interesting.
Yeah, very exciting. And we know that lifestyle issues can affect inflammation. Not just diet. Obviously
Of course.
diet's one, but things like sleep and stress and
correct.
smoking and alcohol and exercise, all really important components of affecting inflammation. So it's really that whole lifestyle thing that's so fascinating. I mean, the World Health Organization, it's sort of come out and said that over the next 10 years, 75% of diseases will be related to lifestyle.
Right.
And yet, we ignore lifestyle. We focus so much on drugs, on pharmaceuticals, and on surgery, and so on. Yet, we have the solution to a lot of our health problems in our own hands.
Right.
We just don't realise it.
So we were talking at lunch, and an amazing low carb lunch, by the way. Thank you very much. But we were talking a little bit about next steps. where do we go from here? How do we help to try? Because my mantra now is becoming like, we want to change the world.
Yeah.
So how do you feel like that the way forward is?
Well, I think the best way of doing it is from people's individual experiences. The more people that take up a low carb diet to improve their health in some way, whether it be their type 2 diabetes or their heart disease or whatever, or their weight loss. I mean, every person who does that and has a good result is another soldier in the army,
Correct,
if you like. Personally, my own sort of challenges, I want to try and get to the medical profession,
right,
and the health professionals, because at the moment we're a funny mob, us doctors. We're very conservative. We're very reluctant to embrace new ideas, because understand, I mean, we see a lot of a lot of theories and a lot of pie in the sky ideas out there, and we've become very skeptical and very cynical, and so our sort of default is to sort of say, no, it's rubbish, it's a fad diet and all this sort of stuff, and yet, when you actually look into it, as I have, and look at the science, there's overwhelming evidence that we've got things wrong for the last 30 years. So but we're very reluctant to admit that, and that's understandable. So from a personal point of view, I want to really try and sort of get the message out to health professionals that this is something they need to look at least. Not just to sort of dismiss it out of hand and say, nah, look, your arteries will clog up and you'll die and all that sort of stuff. So I think if we can get doctors to have an open mind on this and maybe start reading a little bit about it, I encourage them to read Nina Teicholz's book, Big Fat Surprise, and I give them a book, and tell them they've got to read it, and
as long as they hand it on to another doctor.
Hand it on to another doctor
afterwards.
Yeah, that's the deal. Yeah,
Okay.
so I'm happy to. I carry some in my car, and if anyone wants to chat about it, I'll talk, and they say, "Would you read a book?" And they say, "Yeah," and I say, "Okay." So I give them a copy of Nina's book, and I say, "Well, the deal is, you can have the book as a gift, but you've got to hand it on to another doctor," and so on. And every one of them, is blown away by what.
Right. It have to be. If you
cannot read that
half an open mind,
exactly,
you get blown away.
Yeah, it's the best book I've ever read. It's unbelievable. And Big Fat Surprise, Nina Teicholz. It's great, lovely lady, and great book.
Yeah,
so,
totally.
Yeah, and
so you were also talking about, in fact, you've got a meeting coming up like next week or something, right?
Yeah.
And so have you got like a bunch of these meetings with
Yes.
doctors and stuff planned?
Yes, yeah, I've got a whole bunch of meetings with groups of family practitioners around Australia, not just in Melbourne. No.
Okay.
In fact, I'm going over to Perth and other places, and just smallish groups of 20 odd GPs at a time, and just sitting down with them and just taking them through my journey and the sort of the reason I believe in what we're doing, and so far the response has been very good. They're very interested.
That's cool, because I was talking about earlier at lunch about how important that was, because the number of people in the public that are wanting to try this but are going to their doctors who tell them they're going to die is far outstripping the number of doctors that actually are open to the conversation.
Yeah.
And so that's where we need to try and help catch up. So the fact that you're keen to do this and are actually doing it is really cool.
Yeah.
Because I can try and talk to a doctor. I'm an engineer.
Yeah.
I know more about this stuff than they ever will, but I'm an engineer, and so.
But isn't it interesting the way so many leading people in the low carb world are engineers?
Because I think it's
you're rational and logical.
Well, it's because we were taught to question stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
And the doctor's not taught to do that.
Well, look, I mean, the average family practitioner, they don't have the time.
Like you say, it's understandable.
Absolutely.
But
and,
we have to break through somehow.
Yeah.
And I actually almost joke with, we talk about guys locally. We've got Dr. Brian Lanscares and Brett Scher, the cardiologist in San Diego, that are starting to climb on board with this.
Right, yeah.
And I always tease them that they're in the wrong profession. They should have been engineers.
Yeah.
Because it's the ones that are. Because Brett, I asked him how did he get started, and he was saying he was all excited when he got out of college and he started advocating this standard of care, and it wasn't working.
Yeah.
And most of the time, these doctors go through life continuing to do this and never having any success.
Yeah.
And he looked at it and started to think, well, why is this not working?
Yeah.
And that's unusual for a doctor.
Absolutely, yeah.
And
I mean,
we eventually started looking around, found this as a possible solution, and now he's the only one in a cardiology practice of like 9 people that's recognizing this.
Yeah.
But it's a start, right?
Well,
and
yeah.
as this conversation goes on, maybe one day that whole practice will be on board. So
Well, we have, when things aren't working, as an engineer, you look into sort of why aren't they working? And clearly things aren't working. We're getting sicker and fatter every year.
right.
The sort of the line of obesity, sort of going, from 1980 starts there and it just goes in a straight line upwards. And you think at some stage in that sort of, 40 odd years, someone might say, well, hang on a minute, maybe we're doing something wrong here.
Right.
But no, we're too busy. We're too too accepting, I think, of what we get taught in medical school. We all know that half of everything you get taught in medical school turns out to be wrong.
But it's
You just
got to
have
be
work out
hard.
a
You
chart,
study for 10 years and now someone tells you that not everything, but a lot of what you learned there was not right.
Yeah,
It's got to be hard to swallow.
very
right?
difficult, very threatening, and very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of embarrassing in a way. And my initial reaction was I sort of felt embarrassed to be a doctor in some ways. And that I've been telling these people the stuff that for 30 years and it's been wrong.
Right.
I mean, no, I feel really bad about that. I
That's
brought up
what
my
you're
kids
for.
the wrong. I fed my kids the wrong stuff.
Right.
And I was in charge of lunches. And I think, oh my God, what I used to put in their lunch boxes. Because that's what we thought was
Grandchild's
right.
in for a whole different.
Oh, my poor grandchild. I'm going to be the food police. But yeah, look, it's tough to admit that we're wrong. And it's not very nice. Not a nice experience.
Yeah.
To say, hang on, everything I've been saying for 30 years is wrong. I mean,
That is hard.
that's tough.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, what's even worse is continuing when you know it's wrong.
That's right, and that's where I feel, I can forgive them for being taught the wrong stuff and continue to do so. But when they really do see or recognize that it's wrong and then continue to teach otherwise, that's where I have a problem with it. And
But look, a lot of the
for
time
the most
they're
part,
not
I think when they
exposed
do
to
see it,
Yeah, exactly.
they do change. Yeah.
Well, everyone who's read Nina's book, every doctor I know has been convinced. So
that's
I
cool.
mean, you can't not be convinced really. It's such overwhelming evidence. And so look, we've just got to keep working away at it. So and I've also set up an organisation in Australia called Sugar by Half.
Right, I was about to ask you. So
Yeah.
that's the next step.
Yeah, Sugar by Half is it came about basically because of a sense of frustration in that a couple of years ago I was talking to colleagues and bemoaning the fact that we're sending out mixed messages. Everyone's either a low carb, high fat person, or a paleo, or a Mediterranean, or some sort of and what people were telling me, my friends were telling me, was that they were just so confused. They'd sort of known or thought they'd known for 30 years what they were supposed to eat, and now all of a sudden they were confused. And so I sort of thought, well, let's just simplify it. Even though we all have our thoughts on fats and saturated fats and all that sort of stuff. The one thing that everyone agrees on was sugar.
Sugar's really bad, right?
Yeah, sugar is a major problem, and the biggest single problem, I think. And so I thought, well, if we just start a campaign that focuses on sugar, it's not the whole solution, but it's a long way to it. And so I sort of came up with this idea of a campaign to tackle sugar. I feel that campaigns are better if they have a target, so we came up with a target of halving the amount of added sugar. So the average Australian has about 16 teaspoons of added sugar a day. 15 or 16 teenagers have more, but the average is about 15. And the World Health Organization says ideally it should be down to about 6. So, my arithmetic wasn't great, but it's about half. So we thought, let's have an aim for half. And I honestly believe that if let's just say in our wildest dreams we were successful and that we reduced the amount of added sugar by a half, I mean that would have a massive impact on the health of this country and every country.
Every country.
And, I can't think of any other health intervention now that is sort of smoking is sort of done. I mean, even though there's still too many people smoking, but I can't think of any other intervention that would have as dramatic an effect on the health of a nation as cutting sugar by half. So that's we launched that a couple of years ago, and we're active on social media and advocacy, and we're starting to build community-based programs where we get into communities and with them work together with the communities to tackle some of these issues and so on. Because I think that's the secret. I mean, we would like governments to be more active, and they need to be, but I think the key to it is the community groundswell, and if we can get communities thinking about sugar and thinking about reducing their sugar and carb exposure, then we can make a big difference to both this country and other countries.
That's awesome. So, the book.
The book, yes.
You have a new book.
Well, yeah, I've got a new book. I mean, people always said to me, "Oh, you're going to write a book?" I said, "No, there's so many good books around and so on." But they convinced me that there weren't many books by doctors, and no books in this country anyway, in Australia, by a doctor. So I got talked into writing it. So this is it. It's called A Fat Lot of Good.
Okay, and this is you were talking about The Big Fat Surprise by Nina.
Yeah.
This is more for the layman.
This is very much for the
and I think that's really important.
Punter. Yeah.
Because I think once you really get into it, and if you get really absorbed, then reading Nina's book is, even if you're not a doctor, is doable.
Yeah.
But for the average person, it's a bit much.
Yeah.
So this is.
I want someone to be able to pick up, if they hear about low carb or they hear about keto, or they think, what's all that about? And so this is going to give them all the background information. It doesn't tell them what to eat every minute of the day and so on. But what I'm hoping is that it will get people to understand what it's all about, and also give them the information they need to make their own decisions.
Right.
And I think if you read this book, this is basically everything I've learned in the last 6 years. I spent a few hours every day for 6 years devouring every book and article and everything I can about this whole topic, and I've tried to sort of put it down on paper in a sort of a pretty simple layman's terms. Okay. And I'm also hoping that doctors will give this or recommend this to rather than just saying, "Oh, it's all a load of rubbish." They'll say, "Oh yeah, look, there's this book by this crazy Australian doctor, and A Fat Lot of Good," and recommend that. So look, I hope it'll have an impact. All the proceeds are going to Sugar by Half, so I'm not making any money out of it. I just want that message to get out there, and we're all on a mission, aren't we?
Awesome.
And,
so just put it up there so they can see.
Fat Lot of Good.
Okay, there we go. Let's make sure that they can see. Okay.
Fat Lot of Good.
And so this is, you said it's going to be out about 2 weeks. Officially launched about 2 weeks.
April the 30th. It's coming out. It's on Amazon. It's on the Penguin website. It's published by Penguin. And
by the time I get home and finish editing this, it's probably about 2 weeks. So
perfect.
give us the links, and we'll put them in at the bottom for people to go and check it out.
Terrific.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much for your time.